Story once, The Cursed Grave. Jennifer was an avid historian with a particular interest in local lore. When she heard about an old cemetery on the outskirts of her town, she was thrilled to explore it. The cemetery, established in the 1800s, had a reputation for being haunted. Old legends spoke of a cursed grave, said to bring misfortune to anyone who disturbed it. Determined to uncover the truth, Jennifer visited the cemetery on a crisp autumn afternoon. The cemetery was overgrown, with ivy creeping up the weathered headstones and the trees casting long shadows across the gravestones. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Jennifer was excited. She had brought her camera and notebook to document her findings. As she walked among the graves, she came across a section of the cemetery that looked distinctly different from the rest. The headstones here were more ornate, and the ground was more meticulously kept. At the center of this section stood a large, elaborate mausoleum with intricate carvings. It was clear that this was a place of significance. Jennifer's curiosity was piqued, and she decided to investigate the mausoleum. The heavy door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim light from the cracks in the stone barely illuminated the interior. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, and the silence was almost palpable. She made her way to the central crypt, where a large, ornate coffin rested. The inscriptions on the coffin were almost illegible due to age, but one name stood out: Eleanor Caldwell. According to local legends, Eleanor Caldwell was a wealthy socialite who had died under mysterious circumstances. It was said that her spirit haunted the cemetery, seeking revenge on those who disturbed her resting place. Jennifer was about to take a photograph of the coffin when she noticed something peculiar. The inscription on the coffin's lid seemed to be changing before her eyes. The letters shifted and rearranged themselves, forming new words. Jennifer's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the changing inscription. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. The silence was broken by a soft, sorrowful wail that seemed to come from the very walls of the mausoleum. Jennifer turned around, but there was no one there. The wail grew louder, more anguished, and Jennifer felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Desperate to leave, Jennifer stumbled out of the mausoleum and into the cemetery. The once familiar surroundings now seemed strange and threatening. The shadows seemed to lengthen and twist, and the air felt heavy with an unseen presence. She glanced back at the mausoleum, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching her. Jennifer hurried to her car, her heart pounding. As she drove away from the cemetery, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. The wail continued to echo in her mind, a haunting reminder of her encounter with the cursed grave. That night, Jennifer tried to sleep, but she was plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of the mausoleum and the shifting inscriptions, of Eleanor Caldwell's mournful wail and the cold, oppressive silence. When she woke, she felt an unsettling presence in her home. Items were out of place, and a cold draft seemed to permeate the room. Over the following days, Jennifer experienced a series of misfortunes. Her car broke down, her computer crashed, and she began to feel as if a dark shadow was constantly looming over her. The stories she had heard about the cursed grave seemed to be coming true. Desperate to rid herself of the curse, Jennifer returned to the cemetery. She performed a ritual to appease the spirit, leaving offerings and speaking words of apology. As she left, she felt a sense of relief, as if the oppressive weight had been lifted. The misfortunes gradually ceased, and Jennifer's life returned to normal, but she never forgot her encounter with the cursed grave. The experience had left a lasting impression on her, a reminder of the mysteries and dangers that lay hidden in the shadows of history. Story 2. The Midnight Visitor. Mark had always been fascinated by the supernatural. When he heard about the old Grimwood Cemetery, he was eager to investigate. The cemetery was known for its eerie atmosphere and the strange occurrences that happened there. Local legend had it that a ghostly figure, known as the Midnight Visitor, appeared at the cemetery every night at the stroke of midnight. One night, Mark decided to see if the stories were true. He arrived at the cemetery just before midnight, armed with his camera and a flashlight. The cemetery was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. The moon cast an otherworldly glow over the gravestones, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Mark positioned himself near the cemetery's entrance, where the Midnight Visitor was said to appear. He set up his camera and waited. As the clock struck midnight, he felt a sudden drop in temperature, and a shiver ran down his spine. The air grew thick with an oppressive stillness, and Mark's breath became visible in the cold. At exactly midnight, Mark saw a figure emerging from the mist. It was a tall, slender figure dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its movement smooth and fluid. Mark's heart raced as he raised his camera, trying to capture the apparition. The midnight visitor approached a particular grave, an old, weathered headstone that Mark had not noticed before. The figure seemed to be staring at the headstone, and a soft, mournful sigh filled the air. Mark felt a strange sense of sadness and longing emanating from the apparition. As Mark watched, he noticed that the figure began to speak, though no sound came out. The figure's mouth moved in a slow, deliberate manner, and Mark could see the anguish in its eyes. It was as if the figure was trying to communicate something, but its words were lost in the void. Slowly, the figure turned its gaze towards Mark. Its eyes were hollow and dark, and Mark felt a jolt of fear. The figure began to approach him, its movements becoming more frantic. Mark's instincts told him to run, but he was paralyzed with fear. The midnight visitor reached out a hand towards Mark, and a chilling sensation washed over him. It felt as if the figure was trying to reach into his very soul. Mark's camera began to malfunction, the lens fogging up and the screen flickering. In a burst of adrenaline, Mark turned and fled from the cemetery. He could hear the figure's mournful cries echoing behind him, growing fainter as he ran. The cemetery's entrance seemed to stretch endlessly, and Mark's fear made it feel like he would never escape. When Mark finally emerged from the cemetery, he was breathless and shaken. He looked back at the entrance, but the midnight visitor was gone. The cemetery seemed normal again, but the encounter had left him deeply unsettled. In the days that followed, Mark reviewed the footage from his camera. To his horror, the footage showed not only the apparition, but also strange distortions and ghostly figures in the background. The midnight visitor's mournful cries were faintly audible in the recording, a haunting reminder of the encounter. Mark's life was never the same after that night. He felt a lingering presence, as if the midnight visitor had followed him home. Strange occurrences plagued him, objects moving on their own, cold spots appearing in his house, and a sense of being constantly watched. Desperate for answers, Mark researched the history of the cemetery and discovered that the midnight visitor was believed to be the spirit of a woman who had died under tragic circumstances. She was said to be searching for something lost, a grief that bound her to the cemetery. Mark eventually sought help from a local paranormal investigator who performed a cleansing ritual to release the spirit. The disturbances in Mark's home ceased, but the experience left him with a deep respect for the unknown. The midnight visitor remained a legend in Grimwood Cemetery, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. Mark's encounter with the apparition was a chilling testament to the mysteries that linger in the darkest corners of the world.